Hi BookTube, and welcome to a new video. Something I've not done before in all the years I've had my channel. I have no idea how many years that is, and that's just to go through my top 50 books. Some years ago there was a tag video for your top 10, and it's just, you know, I've read a lot of stuff since then that would muscle its way in. But to say that although I'm going to talk about 50 books very briefly, I'm not going to order them 1 to 50. I mean, who's to say whether 36 is better than 37? Although it's probably fair to say that towards the end of this video, there will be my sort of top 10-ish books, which I do sort of prefer even more than the ones that I start this video on. So just a couple of house rules. Only one book per author, although I may mention, give honourable mentions to other books of theirs that could have got in the chart, but I want to keep it to one per author. And also, I'm really only talking novels. I'm not including poetry collections, but I will include poetry that may be thought as prose poems, as long as there's basically, they're not collections, it's like a one themed, you know, that it all relates. So I've got a few of those books in. And I think let's just pile in. So as I say, there's no particular order. Oh, and the other thing is I will limit myself as much as possible to only a couple of sentences per book, because otherwise we will be here all day. Most of these books will have past videos by me reviewing them, but I'm afraid you're just going to have to deep dive, because I'm not going to sort of put the list down in the show notes with the links, because life's too short. Okay, so I'm going to start with B.S. Johnson, The Unfortunates. B.S. Johnson was a British avant-garde author in the 60s. Looks like a book, but actually it's a box with a book. And it says first on that pamphlet, and there's one that says last, but otherwise you can read them in whatever order you want. So years before sort of the internet and digital find your own way through books, B.S. Johnson did it. And it's, I know this one is going to be longer than 2 sentences, but it takes quite a lot of explaining. It's about a football journalist who is returning to his old university town to cover a football match for a newspaper, and it brings up memories of a dear friend of his who died of cancer at a young age. And obviously, as I say, you can read the different sections in whatever order you want. So it's impressions of the city, it's memories of his friend at university, and it's impressions of walking up to the football stadium amongst all the crowds. And right at the end, in the actual sort of body of the book itself, is his match report of the football game. And what you realise is this is about the inadequacy of language, that just as language for talking about a man kicking a ball into a net is fairly limited, trying to grapple with one's feelings about someone who's dying from cancer is, you know, is equally beyond language. On to transcript by Magda Cari. Now, it's very often said that the Holocaust is beyond words, it's too monstrous, it's too big in scale. This book disproves that. Magda Cari was a member of the Hitler Youth, he was Austrian, and after the war he published this, having renounced his sort of Nazi leanings. And what it is bits of the Holocaust as described in bureaucracy, such as train timetables, or graffiti on the walls left by Jewish prisoners, or communiques to the German police, you know, from the Nazis as to how they were to behave. So it's using actual words that were around and about within the Holocaust, proving that you can put words to it. You can show just how crazy this was. You know, some of the political snatches of political speeches from the Nazis. It's an extraordinary language. You know, I highly, highly recommend this. And on to Franz Kafka, The Castle, although honourable mentions for any of Kafka's novels. I prefer this one of all, because even though it's the most unfinished of the three, it shows Kafka at his best, I feel, in terms of it's an extraordinary journey of highs and lows, but it's seamless. You know, you can literally plot it on a graph with no breaks. You know, he's falling. Basically, a guy arrives at a castle. He needs to make an appointment to see the person he needs to see in the castle. He's a surveyor, so he's put up at this inn while he waits for permission to get his sort of proof of entry into the castle, and he falls in love with one of the barmaids there. And as I say, virtually on every page your hope is lifted that he's going to get into the castle, he's going to be happy with this woman, and then it's crushed as he's sort of stymied, and then it up again. And it's just an extraordinary piece of writing. Kafka was such a wonderful puppet master. And on to The Vegetarian, Han Kang. Now this is an imperfect book. It's in 3 parts, and part 3 for me was entirely disposable, didn't need it. I'm talking about parts 1 and 2. Part 1 sees a young Korean woman who's married at a family meal, and she's suddenly sort of repulsed at the idea of eating meat and refuses to eat meat, which causes great sort of shock and scandal amongst her parents. They think that she's disrespecting her elders and the traditions. But it's really part 2, where it's essentially one long drawn out seduction scene of a relative of hers who is going to paint her, but not paint her as a portrait, but actually paint her body. She wants to become, she wants to stop being meat. She experiences her body as meat. She wants to become flora rather than fauna. And this guy is going to help her by painting her body as sort of giant, bouquet of flowers or whatever. But of course he has his own agenda, and there's a sort of sexual, it's not even innuendo, it's pretty blatant, and that causes her to have a breakdown, which leads to part 3. But that second scene, that second section, has some of the most remarkable writing. Bear in mind that this is obviously in translation as well, so the translators did a great job. Highly recommended. And on to Edouard Levay, Suicide. So this is written in second person, and the narrator is addressing a friend of his who has committed suicide. And it's an extraordinary look into the nature of suicide, because 4 days after delivering his manuscript up to his publishers, Edouard Levay, the author, committed suicide. Therefore, every resonance of this book you have to refer back to, well, he knew he was going to commit suicide when he was writing this book. You know, how much of that is in the book? How much can we understand? And I actually think Levay's saying, no, don't look for answers in this book. Yes, it's a book about suicide, but no, it won't unlock the mystery of why I, Edouard Levay, committed suicide. It's a remarkable set of sort of refracting mirrors. It's genius. And on to Amelie Smith, Threadripper. So this is the most Mark Nash book of all Mark Nash books, I think. So it's sort of divided into verso and recto pages, that's left and right pages. On the left is the character has been given a commission to produce an artwork. I can't remember, I think in Denmark, but she's been given it by the EU, I think, a grant to produce an artwork. And the right-hand page is all her thoughts and all her research as to what's going to feed into this. She herself thinks it's going to be something with textiles, with weaving, which of course, as she starts researching, not only leads into sort of other cultures' approaches to weaving, but also the whole history of the computer, because the computer's very, very first fledgling form was a weave, which was done by a Frenchman called Jacquet, which was done with punch cards, which was of course the early form of the computer. And it's just ping-ponging the whole time between the emotional side of family life pressures of meeting this commission on the one hand, and all this wonderful research and symbols and ideas that spark off ideas. I love this book. And on to Dion Brand, The Blue Clerk. So, funnily enough, I talked about verso and recto in regards to this. Similar sort of division here, in that this is a book ostensibly about the left-hand side of the page in a notebook, which Brand would use to make notes or jot down her research or her early ideas, which would go on to form the right-hand page of the final finished poem. but what we are getting here is left-hand pages only. So we're getting all the raw material, all the ratiocination, all the thought processes. But that in itself forms a work of art. It's just tremendous stuff. I will say generally that across these 50 books, what surprises me most is that, you know, I definitely have a type of book that I'm more attracted to picking up and read than not. So I don't do family sagas. I don't do books that are solely, you know, centred around relationships. I veer more towards the experimental side. Not all of these books are experimental. But what surprises me is just how different they are, one from the other. Even within my narrow, supposedly, you know, sort of tunnel vision of seeking out the experimental, there's still a huge diversity. So although these two both employ a sort of a verso recto structure, this is verso only, whereas this is both. And on to Tim O'Brien in The Lake of the Woods. Now, I'm a writer, as you know, and this is the most brilliantly executed technical work. And by that, I don't mean it's dry and not very entertaining. It's a brilliant read in and of itself. But as a writer, I just appreciated the technique of this book. It's wonderful. And why I say that is because, apart from the character work, which I think is very good, O'Brien gradually lulls you into realising that there's 5 possible outcomes to this book. So basically, a guy who fought in Vietnam is standing to be a senator, I can't remember in which state, and some sort of dirty deeds from his time in the army are uncovered by his opponent, which makes him lose the election. So he and his wife, feeling very battered, go to the lakes in Minnesota to get away from it all, to completely cut themselves off and sort of recuperate and recharge. And the wife disappears. And what is so clever is that without sort of pointing you in any one direction, saying this is the most likely outcome, he gives you, as I say, 5 different possibilities of what lies behind her disappearance. Has he killed her? Have they both ditched their lives and sort of rode up to Canada to start again? Has she committed suicide? And, you know, it's just genius. Wonderful stuff. And honourable mention for, of course, the things they carried. And on to Anatomy Courses by Blake Butler and Sean Kilpatrick. I've read a lot of Blake Butler. I've never read anything else by Sean Kilpatrick, but their joint work here is a wonderful assault of the senses through language. You don't really know what's going on, what it's about. You have to submit to its language. The best I can offer, and this is certainly not definitive, is that it's an embryo inside the mother's womb while observing out through the belly button, you know, poetic license, while the parents are having sex. So there's all sorts of weird and wonderful connotations about it, but it's a stunning piece of work, as I say, particularly on the linguistic level. And on to Requiem by Curtis White. Now, my sort of early introduction to postmodernism in literature is books where effectively there were lots of different things, lots of different strands going on, that sort of fragmentary storylines, which may or may not join together thematically, but they could be in different genres, different styles. And the best that I've come across version of that is Curtis White's, because a lot of those books, half of the sort of fragmented stuff works really well, and the other half doesn't, or you get frustrated that you can't put it all together to get the whole picture. With Curtis White, absolutely all comes together, and each individual sort of fragmented section works wonderfully well on its own terms. So there's sort of history of classical composers and the lives they led. There's someone who's lost in the digital world and is communicating with someone who's online. She's desperately trying to get him to rescue her. There's a story about a prostitute. It's just great stuff. I think Curtis White is a really underappreciated author, but I think this is fantastic. And on to Italo Calvino, Invisible Cities. So what I love about this book is its depth of imagination. he invents the architecture of cities that have never existed really, but he also invents their people who populate those cities. The only book I've come across similar to it is David Eagleman's Sum, which I also love, but again represents that great sort of work of the imagination where it's not like you can look outside and everything is familiar, like houses, cars, street lamps. Both Eagleman and also Calvino just wonderfully sort of burst out of that narrow, restricted world viewpoint that we have by looking out of our windows. We just create this stuff without being too fantastical, without you having to suspend your belief in order to enter the world of these cities. Michel Houellebecq, Submission. Now, I know Houellebecq is an author who divides a lot of people. I think this is his best work. It has the premise of a moderate Muslim party winning the general election in France. And one of the acts they do is that all public servants have to convert to Islam or they lose their role. And it's about a university professor who is umming and ahhing as to whether he should convert to Islam. And he takes advice from his friends and colleagues, professional colleagues. But what's so brilliant is that in the end, his decision is made from his sort of emotional deprivation, that it's an affair of the heart that ultimately decides it, not the sort of rationality, not a commitment to the spiritual nature of Islam or the Christianity that he's from. In a way, this guy is an adult incel, because that's ultimately determines everything about this sort of huge life decision. It's very clever, very subversive. And on to Snuff by Victor Pelevin. This is one of the funniest books I've ever read. The second half of it does sort of drift off a bit in terms of quality, but the first half is so funny. It's about two races who periodically, once a year, go to war, but it's a choreographed war. It's choreographed for satellite TV coverage. So the uniforms are designed by fashion designers. They're not sort of, military hardware and, for efficiency on a battlefield. So you get these sort of, rather camp uniforms. It's just hilarious. It's a really, really funny satire. Highly recommend it. As I say, it does drop off a bit in quality in the second half, but still highly worth reading. Third Degree by Italian Michel Marie. I read this year, so one of the more recent ones. And it's basically unravelling a family history in Italy which stretches back to the wartime period and Nazis and French refugees. But what I really love about the book is what it does with language. It all revolves around language, because the person whose memories are feeding in, trying to build up this picture, is a very simple man, but he's also suffering from the early onset of dementia. So the guy who's effectively sort of decocting his memories is having to come up with all these word associations and object associations and symbols to help this guy retain or make an association himself in order to be able to reach back into these memories. It's just so clever. The story itself, in terms of the wartime, what really happened in wartime, is slightly less engaging, but but how we get to those truths is just wonderful. And on to public reading, followed by discussion by Danielle Memoir, French author. This is hilarious. This is sort of postmodernism at its finest, not in the sense of the Curtis White with lots of different streams. This is sort of taking something linguistically to its, to its ultimate extreme, so much so that it sort of bends over and fractures. So it's about an author who is engaged to give a public reading and then to have a sort of Q&A afterwards. She doesn't want to do it. She sends someone in her place who emerges out of the audience. So in a way, the audience are asking another audience member questions. They want a reading from her new upcoming book. She doesn't offer them that. It's just very, very funny how it builds up and builds up and builds up. The author then sneaks into the audience herself to see how it goes. She's in disguise. It's just, as I say, it sort of builds up this sort of absurd turn after absurd turn, within the narrow, limited confines of someone giving a public reading and a Q&A session. Tremendous stuff. Insurrecto by Gina Apostol, who is American of Philippine origins. And this is a whip-crack, smart, acerbic work about colonialism, American colonialism in the Philippines, based around how certain Vietnam movies are shot in the Philippines because at the time it's accessible and cheaper than going to Vietnam. And the colonialism coming in and just how the details are wrong. So, example, those sort of conic hats, Vietnamese and not Filipino. How a bridge that had been destroyed by typhoons was rebuilt by the film company in order to feature in a scene, and then they blew it up in the scene, and it was back to being in a state of complete ruin that they'd found it, rather than actually having some sort of heritage to the people of the Philippines. Well, here's a bridge that is now being repaired, and also how Manila is just a sort of giant American mall. And the movies are, the Schwarzenegger type of movies. It's just really, really smart, funny, acerbic, and a great book on colonialism. And on to Michel Faber, the Book of Strange New Things. I find Faber a bit hit or miss, but for me, this was his apotheosis. This really worked on me. It's a sort of sci-fi world where a planet with life has been discovered, and the one thing that the aliens on the planet seem to respond to best is Christianity. And the story is about a guy who's a preacher or reverend who is going to leave his wife to pursue ministry on this planet. She's pregnant, but he doesn't know that, I think. I can't remember now. It's a long time since I read it. So he's going right to the other end of the universe, leaving his wife alone while everything's falling apart back on Earth, where he's gone to this new world, which is very strange. And although it seems very peaceable, as soon as mankind starts colonising it, of course, it just corrupts everything. And it's so lovely that the race of aliens he creates is just so touching and heartwarming. Unfortunately, of course, they do get slightly spoiled by mankind's arrival, but terrific stuff. Running out of space to put these books I've talked about. Women Talking by Miriam Toews. So, on the face of it, a book about religion and discussing the Bible is about as far away as my interests as you could get, but this is supremely well done. It's about a group of Mennonite women who've been drugged, and in their sleep they've been raped by the males in their community. The men have been arrested temporarily while this is being investigated, so the women have the community to themselves, other than an outsider male. And they meet in a hayloft to discuss what their next move is going to be. Are they going to stay? Are they going to leave the community? And Mennonite women are not given an education. They don't read and write. That's why this outsider male is there to transcribe effectively the minutes of their meeting, which wasn't a great device actually. But what I really loved about the book is not so much the women talking about their feelings, but when they try and interpret everything according to the Bible, of which they only have an oral knowledge of, they don't have a literary knowledge of. And basically the women are split apart between those who go for literal interpretations of the Bible versus those who go into more metaphorical and symbolic interpretations. And it just seemed to be so fundamental to literature and language and how language works that I just thought it's the best study of that I've ever come across. And on to Knox by Anne Carson, who is a poet, but a lot of her work is prose poetry. And a bit like The Unfortunates, it comes in a box and in this sort of concertina style. And it's called Knox because it's a meditation around the death of her brother and trying to understand and sort of give it some context for herself. She wasn't particularly close to her brother, which is one of the things she regrets. One of the things I really liked about this is there's a lot of definition, literally dictionary definitions that she produces of Latin words. in order to try and come to grips with this. It's just spellbinding, absolutely spellbinding. Of all the Carson works I've read, which is about 4 or 5, it's in a way the most channeled. You know, it keeps on theme. It's not sort of a bit like the Curtis White stuff where, you know, free ranges over all sorts of things. This is tight, tight, tight. Right. Okay, Duck's Nude Report. Again, a book I know that alienates a lot of people. It's 1,000 words, and she has annoying speech patterns. No, she doesn't. As a writer and as a reader, I feel that most books do not reproduce how real humans think. Not necessarily what they think, but how they think, how our brains work, how thoughts shoot across our consciousness. Some we grab hold of, some are obliterated by other thoughts. All are coloured by the emotional footpath that they pass through. And this book does that through its main character. Very ordinary woman, housewife, bakes cookies, has anxieties about, you know, the danger of the insecurity of the world under Trump. But she, you know, in some ways it's repetitive, but we are repetitive. Our thoughts are repetitive. We very rarely break out of our thought patterns. And this is the best representation, other than maybe one other book that's here somewhere, of how human beings, how we operate, how our minds work. Utterly, utterly spellbinding. And yes, it's 1,000 pages long, but actually you whistle through it because it's not difficult language. It's not dealing in difficult sort of concepts. It's just reproducing how you and I and our minds work. William S. Burroughs, The Place of Dead Roads. So Burroughs' early work, very heavily influenced by the cut-up method. And it was really only when he produced his trilogy, of which this was the first, that I really feel Burroughs' work came to its full maturity. That everything he'd been playing around with, experimenting with in the early works, come together in this trilogy. So this is a book about a sex plague. This is just before AIDS broke, so in some ways it was prescient, and it's fast moving, it's remorseless. It's about a sort of gang of boys. So there's, you know, Burroughs is sort of well known writing about gay themes, but it's just, as I say, it all comes together brilliantly in this book, and it's prescient on, you know, predicting a sex plague. Philip Roth, The Great American Novel. So Americans seem to be obsessed with this concept of a single book that encapsulates America, that is the Great American Novel. And what's so funny about this, about Roth, is that he's chosen to cite the Great American Novel in the world of semi-professional baseball. It's hilarious. It's really, really funny. It has a big cast of characters, each are tightly delineated and defined and separate from the other characters. There's some wonderfully funny scenes here, particularly when a pitcher is being sort of stymied by the umpire, is getting more and more incensed. You do need to know about baseball to pick up some of the minutiae of this. And unfortunately, I'm a big baseball fan, but I just love this, and it's very funny. And it's not half as sexist as everything else that Roth writes. The Night Alphabet by Joel Taylor, published either at the end of last year or the beginning of this, can't remember now. So Taylor is a poet. This is her first novel, and it is all about the poetic language. It's so many wonderful images in here, page after page after page of stuff that you would, you know, happily see in poems. And it's a bit like Bradbury's The Illustrated Man, only here it's an illustrated woman covered head to toe in tattoos, and she goes to a tattooist in our contemporary times to basically have a linkage for all these tattoos on her body, and in doing so reveal to them the story behind them, because they don't know, because they are all time travellers, but she knows it, but the other two don't realise it, and she's offering them the chance to understand their linkage, and it's just beautiful. William Gadis, Agape, Forgive the ancient Greek pronunciation or butchering. So Gadis was dying when he wrote this book. You can see it's very small, when he's most famous for his humongous books like J.R. and The Recognitions, which I would also recommend, but I'd say only one per author. And this is a book about a man in hospital, a writer in hospital who's dying and is trying to finish his last book before he dies, as this was. I think it came out after he died, but he did complete the writing of it. And it's a review of art and life and mass-produced art in the form of the player piano, Plato and the ideal forms, language, and his own devotion to writing, where as a patient in a hospital bed, his body is literally full of staples. His skin is like parchment, it's like paper, because he's at the end of his life. He's devoted his life to writing, so much so that he's turned into a book itself. Terrific stuff. Trust by Hernan Diaz. So this is a book that takes real risks. It's 4 parts, 4 different versions of the story. The first is a bit of a hatchet job novel based on a true robber baron financier in America in the 20s, without sort of naming him, because it is a work of fiction. But it's not a brilliant piece of literary work. As I say, it's more about a hatchet job. Book 2 is the response to the real life financier. Again, you know, he's a financier. He's not naturally gifted with language, so again, sort of not great writing. And at this point, it's understandable if readers drop out. But it's really from part 3 that the book turns and reveals its genius. So part 3 is a young immigrant woman. Her father came over from Italy because he was chased out for being an anarchist and can't get any work because of his political leanings. But his daughter gets the gig of being commissioned by this financier to write his life story. There are certain prescriptions that she can't write, mainly around his wife. And then part 4 is written by the wife. It's journals she keeps. We finally get to hear her voice. It's not represented by other people. And she's dying in a sanatorium in Switzerland. And the writing in this section is unbelievably good. It's like writing at the point of death, you know, sort of passing in and out of consciousness. It's superb. House of Leaves. I'm not sure this needs a lot of introduction. I really like it because it's an architectural novel. I'm not sure how much of that you're going to be able to see, because I can't see what pages this is landing on. But the text is arranged on the page in what I call architectural fashion, because the plot of the book, such as it is about an ever-expanding house. But it's so much more than that. It's a book about mental illness, in the way that there are many different characters framing the story, and then that story sort of falls into somebody else's hands. It's just like a labyrinth, navigating a labyrinth. Yeah, it's terrific. Skin Lane by Neil Bartlett. So this book has the best depiction of desire and lust and passion that I've ever read in a book. It's called Skin Lane because it's set in a cutting room workshop where cow hides are treated, having been treated, and then cut into, you know, making things like leather jackets, leather trousers. So you get this sort of really visceral, I mean, I know it's literally not visceral because the organ's already been removed, but a sort of visceral description of this sort of cutting into cow flesh. And the guy who oversees this workshop, he has a crush, which is unrequited, on one of his young male workers. The worker is heterosexual, so it remains unfulfilled. But the sort of comparison of how he describes this man, this young man, really sort of rubs up and chimes against the symbology of cutting into cow flesh. It's extraordinary. I Hate the Internet is the funniest book I've ever read, I think. Funniest work of fiction that I've ever read. Derek Kobek is as smart as a whip. It is about the internet, but it's also dissecting it for, you know, race, class, you know, pointing out that the tech gurus of California make money out of scandal and controversy and you know, any big time argument that breaks out over social media just mints more money for them because the advertisers are prepared to pay more money. This was written in around 2016, and there was a big hullabaloo about it, and I wasn't aware of it at that point. I came to it later than that, but it seems to have died a death. People don't talk about it anymore, and I know part of the reason that possibly is because there have been so many books since about social media. You know, Dave Eggers wrote The Circle. There was there are books I've read about, you know, other sort of forms of social media. But this still stands head and shoulders above them. It's smarter, it's more acute, it dissects and gets to the heart of social media and the changes it wreaks upon our brains and our behaviour far better than anything I've read since. And it's funny. Plume by Will Wiles. So this book overcomes a serious cross against it in my book, because the main character is an alcoholic, a serious alcoholic, and I am so over books about alcoholics and addicts, having grown up in a household with one. But despite that, it's a superb work about London. It's changing architecture, it's changing culture, it's changing sort of social usage in terms of what those new buildings, both in a work and a leisure space, offer and don't offer. But it's also about the digital world, the digital technology, in that the main character is sort of trackable at any moment within this new London through geo-disc or whatever it's called, through, you know, you can be tracked through your phone and all that sort of stuff. So you've got the sort of architecture of London being very fluid, very mobile, and his own perambulation, you know, peripatetic wanderings through London are equally fluid, but they are tracked by this sort of digital surveillance. The Octopus Man by Jasper Gibson. So all too often when mental illness is used in fiction, it's used in order to enable certain symbols, metaphors, certain language. You know, it's treated with literary language, and one thing about mental illness is it's often, you know, not a literary phenomenon in terms of the language of its sufferers and those afflicted by it. This is the most authentic treatment of, in this case, schizophrenia that I've ever come across. And indeed, in the back, he dedicates it to a friend of his who had schizophrenia and died at age 44. This is just, you know, tremendous stuff. And on to the Merceau investigation by Kamel Daoud, who I think is, let me get this right, I think he's Algerian but lives in Tunisia and works in Tunisia. I hope it's that way around. So Albert Camus' book The Stranger, which is pretty much the first grown-up book I ever read and got me into reading, is a book where a French colonial in Algeria, when it was still part of the French Empire, shoots dead an Algerian on the beach and is sort of locked up awaiting trial. And this book is a riposte to it, because as much as Camus was sort of writing about colonialism, he effaced the Arabs in his story in the same way as Merceau, the main character in that story, literally killed an Arab. And what this book does, it imagines the dead Arab's brother and his mother, but it's told really from the viewpoint of the brother, you know, saying, you're not going to efface us, you're not going to erase us, you know, you're telling Merceau's story because he's French, but what about the Algerians? And it's one of the angriest books you'll ever read, but it's also very well written. You know, there's lots of good writing with good imagery and stuff. Highly recommended. I don't think many people know about this book. Michael Winkler, Grimmish. So this starts off as a sort of a biography of an American boxer who in the early 20th century came over to Australia and made a living by basically being a human punch bag, because he didn't feel pain. He could just take infinite amount of punches, and it was a bit of a freak show where, you know, he'd rock up at an Australian village or whatever and challenge the locals to see if they could knock him down and hurt him, and of course they never could. And that's sort of the bulk of the opening of the book, but gradually it slides over into a narrator's voice who is a writer, is the writer of this Joe Grimm's biography. And it's increasingly talking about his own struggles and his own challenges and his own sort of being a human punchbag in the literary world, of, you know, facing rejection, of toiling for no money. And I don't mean to make it sound self-indulgent, because it isn't. It's done really well. It sort of slides in as you're unaware that that's, you know, where this book is heading up. It's really well done. And Femme by Romanian Magda Cari, who is a poet, and if you read this book you can see why, because she's basically writing about an alternative value system, an alternative way of looking at the world, which is very much about how everything is linked, you know, on a sort of cosmic level, from, you know, the humble cell inside each of us to, you know, the biggest planetary systems, which is not a viewpoint I agree with or have a lot of time for, but she does it in such a convincing, poetic, eyebrow-raising, just in terms of some stunning metaphors, that I was utterly charmed by it. I wasn't won over to her arguments, but any book that can make me read on and pursue an argument that I have absolutely no agreement with gets my respect. And onto the longer form by Kate Briggs. So this is a story about a newly single mother. Sorry, she's a new mother who's a single mother in her basement flat in Camden. It's just her and her baby, and she's you know, a bit worried that her brain is going to turn to mush because she can't have any adult conversation, things like that. So she resolves that she's going to read Tom Jones by Henry Fielding during the, you know, the gaps in between tending for the baby. And Fielding claimed that his book at the time was revolutionary, a new form of the novel. And there's a lot of sort of interaction between the real life in Camden with a baby and her best friend, who's the only person who really comes to visit her, and the Fielding book. It's just supremely well done. Really enjoyable read. You know, I was slightly perturbed going to this, oh, how academic is it? I haven't read Tom Jones, but no, not at all. Utterly, utterly charming. And onto a book, Untitled, by Armenian-American author Shushan Avagayan. Really hard to sum this book up, but it's a very radical take on what we mean by fiction, autofiction, translation, history, memory. So it's basically two Armenian women authors in the early part of the 20th century, who've both disappeared out of the Armenian canon, primarily at the hands of the communists, because Armenia was part of the Soviet Union. And two modern women meet up trying to basically reinstate them and resurrect their work to put them back in the canon. But in doing so, they raise all these questions. You know, it's a book untitled, so there's a disquisition on, you know, titles in books, and it's just really wonderful take on what a book is, what a work of fiction is, what memory is. And all this within the historical, you know, I didn't know anything of these two female writers, but, you know, it's a wonderful history at the same time of Armenia as it sort of kept changing hands, from the Armenian genocide at the hands of the Turks to, you know, falling into Soviet Union, and now it's independent. Just terrific stuff. Now we're getting on to the last set of books, which I'd say were sort of in my, you know, upper echelons of my favourites, in that I slightly prefer these to all the ones I've talked about, but there's not necessarily much in it. So the first is Austerlitz by W.G. Sebald. It could have been The Rings of Saturn, honourable mention for that, but I think Austerlitz is a more contained piece, so I think Sebald fans might prefer this because it's more diffuse, more sort of metaphysical in a way. But this is a wonderful book about sort of a portrait of a character who was on the Kindertransport out of Prague into England, and has no memories of that previous life in Prague, can only remember their life in England. And this is a photo, supposedly, of this child when he was still in Prague at age 4, And it turned out to be nothing of the sort. This is a found image that Sebald found in a junk shop in the UK. And that, you know, that is the mastery that Sebald has over you. He spins these delicate gossamer webs, and as you follow the trails, then suddenly they break off and go in a completely different tangent, but it all holds together superbly in Austerlitz. I love it. Georges Perek, 53 Days. Now, again, with Perek, I could have chosen a number of titles, such as Life a User's Manual, W or A Memory of Childhood. But I've gone for this one, which is the last book he wrote as he was dying of cancer. Part 1 is written as a piece of detection fiction. That a Frenchman in colonial Africa is asked to read over this script. But the writer disappears, so it becomes its own sort of murder mystery or vanished mystery. So that's part 1. Part 2 is the decoding of that, because it's actually telling a story which has nothing to do with Africa or French colonialism. It's about the French resistance during the Second World War and an act of betrayal when a load of resistance fighters were betrayed to the Nazis and killed. And then part 3 is a sort of sketch and notes for part 2. So you get you're deliberately fed the impression that it's unfinished, that there's more to come, but it was cut short by Perek's death. I don't believe that for one moment. I think it's so artfully done that Perek is written part 3 deliberately sort of fractured and half formed, because he's saying to death, screw you, death, I get to finish my last novel. You know, the two of his Aleppo movement writer friends, you know, sort of acclaimed to have put together part 3, having found his notes after his death. Again, I think they were in on it. So, absolutely intriguing novel. The Damned United by David Peace. So this is about a football manager who was an obsessive, who was anxiety-ridden by the thought of failure, and it's all about the language, the rhythms, the repetitions, a bit like Ducks Newburyport, in that this book, together with Ducks, represents the best representation of how a human being thinks. It's different to Ducks, because Ducks is definitely a female mind, and this is definitely a male mind. But that's why I think they can both coexist. They're two of the, in a way, they're two of the few books out of these 50 that actually share a lot of features with one another. It's just a psychological insight into a human mind, working at a very high level, in this case, professional sport. I will say that the film is dreck. Ignore the film, don't see the film, read the book. And Clarice Lispector, no, I'm going to come back to Clarice. So, Laurent Binet, The Seventh Functional Language. If I say to you French academia, the likes of Althusser and Derrida and Foucault and all these people, what doesn't come to mind is laughs, barrel load of laughs, but this is so funny, so funny. It's basically about a document that was produced about sort of rhetoric, and that if you followed the 7 prescriptions of this document, of the rhetoric, that you will win any argument. And it's stolen when Roland Barthes is killed in an accident, which really happened. He was hit by a dry cleaning lorry, I think. And he had this document on him at the time, and when he's found, it's not there anymore. And the great fear is that this will find its way into the hands of one of the 2 presidential candidates, Mitterrand, or I think it was Chirac, and give them, and basically it will tilt the election into whichever one's hands, because no one will be able to resist the power of their arguments. So a detective is sent to recover this document, but of course he doesn't know anything about semiotics and rhetoric and all this sort of stuff. So he hires a young academic in semiotics, and the scene in which he recruits him, how this academic shows him how semiotics can be so powerful, is a brilliant scene. But then they go on this journey to try and get hold of the document, but it's hilarious, you know. It gets more and more absurd. You know, it starts off in the world of these academics who are very competitive. Some of them, you know, live and breathe their work, conduct their lifestyles according to it. Others are just, in a way, sort of being very snarky and putting out all this philosophy and how to live life, but don't live their life like that at all. It gets more and more absurd as to, you know, the interactions and the happenings of these academics. It's great fun. Nervous System by Lina Murain, who's Palestinian of Chilean. I think she lives in Chile now. This just has some of the best writing and metaphorical writing I've ever read. It's just a study of a female character who has sort of undiagnosed, no one can get to the bottom of it, of her sort of health problems. And it talks about her brother and her father and, you know, the fact that they're Palestinian and now she's in the West. But it's just the quality of the writing here. It's just so many wonderful paragraphs. And on to Scarlet Thomas, Our Tragic Universe. Now, in a way, of the 50 books, this is the one I'd sort of most hesitant to recommend, because it's going to annoy a lot of people if they do pick it up, because it's a book about non-Western forms of storytelling. It's a quest to seek the storyless story, and obviously draws on non-Western cultures. And if there's any action, because a lot of it is people visiting each other and having cups of tea with them, if there's any action that happens, it happens off the page. And I can see that people expecting a story are going to be really, really frustrated with it. But actually, this says so much about the nature of storytelling, how important it is to humans, and whether that's a good thing or not, how stories are put together, how they work on us. I love this book, but as I say, I'm slightly hesitant to recommend it unreservedly. And on to Milkman by Anna Burns. My breakout novel was set in Northern Ireland. This book is also about Northern Ireland. A very different style than mine, which is so poetic. Again, the language here is poetic. It's basically about a young girl who walks around Belfast with her nose in a Victorian novel, which is already suspicious behaviour in the eyes of the city folk. And this guy, who's a senior terrorist, takes a fancy to her, which makes her life infinitely complex and infinitely threatened. And just her family members. She has what are called the wee sisters, 3 little girls, who are just so funny. The comedy in this is extraordinary, because it's always a lot sort of brutal menace is the atmosphere hanging over this book, and yet she derives a lot of humour and a lot of beautiful language from it. Now to Clarice Lispector. So The Passion According to G.H. Clarice Lispector is consistently the most intense author that you could wish to read, and of all her books, this is the most intense. I mean, I read this in 25-page bursts and was exhausted after each one. I mean, you really can't just sit down and read it in a day, short as it is. It's so intense. It's basically about a woman who's in Argentina, whose maid has left her, and she goes in to clean the maid's room. And the wardrobe there is the door's half open, and as she shuts it, a cockroach is squashed between the door and the jamb. And that sets off a whole sort of metaphysical contemplation. And it's really intense because she'll offer up something and try and relate it to her, and then she'll come down on the side, or maybe it's the opposite. And you're really sort of left not high and dry, because that sounds critical, but it's very hard to get your bearings as to who this woman is. But that's how humans are. You know, we are full of contradiction. We are full of cognitive dissonance. And the language and the metaphysical stuff that under consideration at stage is so intense. Before I carry on, there's one book I no longer own, because unfortunately it succumbed to my flood in my shed library, and it's too rare and too expensive to replace, and that is Evan Dara's The Lost Scrapbook, which is a book of continual dialogue, not attributed to anyone, no one's given a name, very like Mrs. Dalloway, hopping from one head inside one head into another, and again not necessarily signposting that it's moved on to a new person. And then gradually it moves, you see that these are the residents of a town who are suffering from an ecological disaster, a bit like Flint, Michigan and its water crisis, and that these are all the voices in the debate as the town is trying to, you know, save itself effectively. Really, really subversively powerful. Creeps up on you. Cobralingus by Jeff Noon. Now, Jeff Noon writes sort of sci-fi and now crime thrillers. They do have a bit of a tweak on them, but in his earlier career, he was really very radical, and this is one of those. So, I've already said how William Burroughs' early work is sort of the cut-up method, and I never really got on with that because I couldn't recognise the original text that were being cut up, which Burroughs said gave you the echoes of the text you were reading, i.e. his text, but then you were getting the echoes. I never got that. Cobralingus shows you all the steps in a cut-up method, and he also employs, sort of a bit like House of Leaves, he also employs, you know, the layout on the page. See if I can find. So he tells you what source texts, takes you through the changes, the mutations, when you end up with the final text. So you get things like that. And the thing is that each of these steps, each of these sort of stories, works in and of itself. They're not just experiments or way stations on the way to the final text. Each one has integrity, literary integrity, and holds up. Yeah, that's what I wanted to show you. An apple with a bite out of it. Okay, four more to go. My 4 favourite books, unreservedly. So, important artefacts and personal property from the collection of Leonore Doolan and Harold Morris, including books, street fashion and jewellery. And this is by Leanne Shapton. And this is a picture book in a way. There's very little text. There is a bit of text. So this is like a mock auction catalogue where a couple are splitting up and all of their possessions are being auctioned off. And you can tell from these possessions and the provenance of them, whereby maybe an email refers to them, the problems in this relationship. And you realise that when we buy our loved ones presents, often it's quite a passive-aggressive act because we're saying, we think you should like this. So if you buy someone a CD of a band that's not in their collection, you might be saying unconsciously, you know, I love this band, you need to love this band as well. Or it's something you think they you know, that's not necessarily a reflection on you, it's something you want them to have, not because you've got it or you like it, but you deem that it's going to improve them in a way that you like, even though you yourself don't have such a thing. So there's a lot of passive aggression bleeding through the pictures and the names of the auction items. Very, very clever. I love this. Also, by definition, it won't take you long to read because there aren't many words. The Lost Children Archive by Valeria Luiselli. So this is right at the beginning I said I'm not really into books about relationships. This is the best book about a family and specifically children of all the books I've ever read. It's about a blended family. They're going on a road trip from New York to Arizona. Both the parents have their own projects, sound projects. They're both sound engineers. The husband wants to record the sort of sounds of the lost. I think they were Apaches. I can't remember which tribe of Native Americans from Arizona, but he wants to sort of somehow record their absence. And the wife is concerned with the children who manage to cross the border but then disappear, hence Lost Children Archive. So the immigrant children who get separated from adults and God knows what happens to them. But the lost children of the title also refer to their own 2 children of the blended family because this family is breaking up and no one really knows that at the beginning of the journey. And it really gets to you when you realise this family are going to break up and the half-brother, half-sister are going to be separated from each other, which is absolutely tragic. It's brilliantly written, it's wonderfully structured, the devices she uses of the sound recordings, each of the 4 characters is given boxes to put in things from this road journey because it's supposed to be a great event of the family. Of course, it all falls apart, and then right at the end, what are in the 2 children's boxes is revealed. It's just absolutely gut-wrenching. Ben Marcus, The Age of Wire and String. So this is a strange language where words are put together you wouldn't normally put together. It doesn't seem to make much sense, but has a strange poetic beauty of its own. And gradually you realise that this is the perspective of a non-human, that they have access to all our words in dictionaries and lexicons, but they don't have access to the organic nature which sentences are put together, and nor do they know what these activities are describing. So if you think about it, think about a swing that's made out of a tyre. You know, tyres you see on cars, and swings which are sort of frames with ropes or whatever. This is not natural stuff that, you know, that you can figure out. And when you have to try and apply words, you know, tyre, frame, rope, it gets even more complicated. And this whole book is an alien consciousness trying to piece these things together, getting it wrong, and yet in doing so, sort of judging our value system of our objects and of our lives and our language. Just absolutely stupendous stuff. And finally, my favourite ever book, David Markson, This Is Not a Novel and Other Novels. This book speaks to me as a writer because it makes me question everything I thought and I knew about fiction. It's constructed entirely out of actual writings and words of real historical figures, which thereby are not fiction. They're actual things that were said by actual people. And yet he weaves a work of fiction out of it. It starts off with a novelist figure called Writer, who one assumes is David Markson himself, saying he's exhausted by having to come up with new plots, new characters, and he wants to write a book that is without plot, without characters, without scenery, without description, but it must be a page-turner. And we get all these snippets from historical figures that are grouped together, and it's that grouping which gives this meaning and movement and makes you turn the page. And included in these historical figures, who may be politicians, sportsmen, musicians, painters, novelists, just other figures from history. Inserted in there are things about how they died, grouped together by disease, in what conditions they died. So I think it was Zora Neale Hurston died in absolute poverty. How Dante, no, not Dante, I can't remember which Italian poet. No one read his work for two centuries, but he was rediscovered by two Italian poets of later centuries. And then he became, you know, recognised for the genius he was. But it could have gone either way. He could have remained forgotten. And there are words from critics in this. And I think this goes to the heart of partly what this book is, because it's about legacy. It's about, you know, what does a writer leave behind on their death. And you know, a writer could call their work whatever they like. Markson, or the narrator in this, calls his work at various stages a polyphonic orchestral piece, a mural, his version of Finnegan's Wake. So, you know, the artist is asserting his right to call his work or their work whatever they like, but by inclusion of the critics, it recognises that will be taken away from you, because the critics and the audiences and the readers, they're going to rebrand it whatever they think it is, and that the artist really is not in control of their own legacy long after they're dead. Just wonderful. And the other two books in this use the same technique of these sort of factoids, but they're doing slightly different things. So there you have it, my top 50 books. Of course that can change with the next book I read. I'm going to read Solenoid in July, so that I'm fairly certain should burrow its way into my top 50. How high up, who knows? I hope you find that of interest. If you have a real burning need to find my full video review of any of the books, you can pop it in the comments, and if that sort of stays manageable and controllable, I will. I know, because I can't post links in the comments, can I? Damn. Yes, okay, that plan's not going to work. Talk to me on Twitter. I can always post you the link to my original review. Okay, so that's a really long video, but I was talking about 50 books. Till next time, thanks very much.